It was a night like any other until the moment she collapsed.
Heidi Broussard, a seemingly healthy, vibrant woman, had been fine just moments before. 1 minute, she was laughing with her husband Stephen in their cozy Colorado home. The next, she was gasping for air, her body convulsing as if it had turned on her without warning.
The paramedics arrived, but it was too late.
What should have been a routine night turned into an agonizing nightmare for her family Dot in the blink of an eye. Heidi's world crumbled. A woman who had been married to a well-respected dentist, someone who seemed devoted to her, and the father of their children.
But all of that was a lie, because beneath the surface of this picturesque family was a story darker than anyone could imagine. As her body slipped into a coma, the truth began to unfold.
Heidi had been poisoned with cyanide, one of the most lethal and undetectable poisons known to man. But the cyanide wasn't the whole story. It was merely the beginning of a twisted tale of betrayal, deceit, and a jailhouse murder plot that would unravel in front of everyone.
Behind the scenes, while Heidi fought for her life, her husband Stephen was living a double life, one that would lead him down a road so dark it would destroy everything he had worked for. As the investigation into Heidi's poisoning grew more
intense, a pattern emerged. Stephen wasn't just any dentist. He was hiding a secret life and affair with another woman. This affair wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was the spark that ignited everything that came after. It was more than just an illicit relationship. It was the reason behind the death sentence that was silently slipping into Heidi's bloodstream. It was why Stephen had been so careful, so calculating, and why he thought he could get away with it all.
But the twisted plot didn't stop at poisoning. As Heidi's health continued to deteriorate, detectives discovered something far more chilling. It wasn't just about getting rid of a wife.
It was about a plan that had been set into
motion long before that fateful night.
As investigators pieced together the clues, it became clear that the man who had sworn to protect Heidi had been plotting her death for months.
And to make matters worse, he had recruited a criminal mastermind while behind bars.
Stephen had been in contact with a convicted killer, a man in jail, plotting the perfect murder from the comfort of his cell. What could drive a man to betray the woman he'd promised to love forever? What pushes someone to go to such extreme lengths, planning the end of a life that was supposed to be sacred? In the search for answers, the real shock came not from the cyanide or the affair, but from the lengths Stephen was willing to go to in
order to cover his tracks.
This wasn't just about one crime. It was a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and a plot so evil that it could only be the work of someone who thought they had all the time in the world to get away with it.
But little did he know, the investigation was just beginning, and with every passing day, the walls were closing in on the man who thought he could get away with murder. As the days passed after Heidi's collapse, the air in the small town of Colorado Springs grew thick with uncertainty.
Heidi, lying unconscious in a hospital bed, was fighting for her life while the police were fighting to uncover the truth.
The cyanide in her system was undeniable, but what led to it? Who could have wanted to kill her?
And why?
Detectives had no reason to believe Heidi's husband, Stephen, would be involved.
He was a well-respected dentist, the kind of man who could charm anyone with his boyish smile and confident demeanor.
He was the perfect picture of a loving husband and devoted
father.
But as they dug deeper into his life, the picture began to crack. At first, it was a rumor, a whisper from a former employee at Stephen's dental practice.
The employee had overheard hushed conversations of moments where Stephen seemed too nervous
to look people in the eye, even when he should have been at his most confident.
Then, the investigators uncovered something that made their hearts race. Stephen had been having an affair. The affair was more than just a brief fling, it was an ongoing relationship, one that had been going on for months. But it wasn't the affair
itself that sent chills down the investigators' spines.
It was the timeline.
The affair hadn't just started after Heidi's poisoning.
It started long before, hinting at a much deeper betrayal. Was Stephen's affair a sign of dissatisfaction in his marriage, or was it part of something darker, something far more sinister?
As the investigation into Stephen's personal life continued, more troubling details emerged.
One of the most shocking discoveries was the way Stephen had acted the day Heidi collapsed, the day she was poisoned.
He had acted strangely calm, too calm for a man whose wife was fighting for her life.
He didn't rush to the hospital. He didn't seem frantic, he almost seemed detached. He had an explanation for everything, but the more he spoke, the more his answers sounded rehearsed, like a man who was trying too hard to cover his tracks. And then came the phone calls .at The investigators thought it was a fluke, a man in prison reaching out to a dentist. But
as they dug deeper, they realized this wasn't just a random connection. Stephen had been in regular contact with a convicted criminal, a man serving time for a violent crime in the state penitentiary.
the phone records revealed several calls between Stephen and this man, some lasting only a few minutes, others far longer.
But what was most chilling were the conversations themselves.
The content of the calls was enough to send shockwaves through the investigation team. It wasn't about business.
It wasn't about friendship. These weren't the kind of conversations that people have when they're just talking about life.
No, these were cold, calculated conversations, the kind that felt like a man preparing for a dark, irreversible decision.
The calls were happening at the same time Heidi's health was deteriorating.
Was the prison inmate involved in the plot? Was he somehow helping Stephen carry out the murder?
It all began to make sense in a twisted, terrifying way.
The cyanide wasn't the only plan.
There was something bigger behind it all, something orchestrated from within the confines of a prison cell.
The perfect crime had been in the works for months, and the investigators were just beginning to understand the extent of the conspiracy. But the real question remained. Could they stop it before it was too late, or had Stephen already won? The more they uncovered, the more it became clear this was not just a poisoning. It was a calculated scheme that was far from over, and time
was running out to stop it. As Heidi's condition worsened in the hospital, the once tight fabric of her life began to unravel in ways no one could have anticipated.
The woman who had devoted herself to her family, her children, and her marriage now lay unconscious, her future uncertain.
For her friends and family, the shock of her sudden collapse was compounded by the realization that the cause was nothing natural.
The loving husband, Stephen, whom they all knew, was now a suspect in a case that was as unimaginable as it was heartbreaking. Heidi's best friend, Laura, couldn't shake the thought of how it all seemed so perfect to perfect.
Heidi had been vibrant, full of life, and always so happy when she was around her family.
And then, in a flash, everything changed.
Laura sat at her friend's bedside, her eyes red from crying, her heart aching from the confusion. How could Stephen do this? How could he, someone she had always seen as a doting husband, have played a role in poisoning the woman they all loved? Laura thought back to the last conversation she'd had with Heidi.
It was a simple chat about life, about kids, family, and the usual things that women talk about. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. But there was one thing Heidi had said that now echoed in Laura's mind with a chilling clarity. Heidi had mentioned that she felt something was off in her marriage, that Stephen seemed distant, distracted.
Laura had brushed it off as the stress of life. Everyone had their moments. Little did she know, those moments were a farce that had been carefully constructed, hiding the turmoil beneath. For Heidi's mother, Margaret, the pain was almost unbearable. She had raised her daughter to be strong, independent, and wise. When Heidi had married Stephen, Margaret had hoped for nothing but happiness for the two of them.
She had always liked Stephen. He was charming, polite, and seemingly perfect for her daughter. The man she had welcomed into her family, however, was not the man she had thought him to be. The cruel reality that her son-in-law had betrayed her daughter in the most heinous way possible left her feeling helpless. Margaret spent long hours at Heidi's bedside, staring at her daughter's still form, as if willing her to wake up, too.
Give some sign that everything would be all right. But as the days passed with no sign of improvement, the weight of this situation became impossible to ignore.
The daughter she had raised with so much love, the woman she had watched grow into a strong, beautiful individual, was being slowly stolen away. And behind it all was the man she had trusted as a son. What made it even harder for Margaret to grasp
was the fact that her daughter had been so full of life, so full of dreams and plans.
Heidi had just been planning a vacation with the family, a getaway to relax and recharge.
She had talked about starting a new project, about getting back into the things that had always made her happy.
She had a future until it was taken away from her in the cruelest of ways. The person who should have been her protector, the one who had vowed to cherish and love her, had turned into her executioner. But it wasn't just the emotional devastation that consumed those closest to Heidi, it was the sheer sense of betrayal.
They couldn't understand how Stephen had gone from the loving husband and father to a man willing to destroy his family for his own selfish desires.
The man who had promised to be there for Heidi through thick and thin, the man who had walked down the aisle with her, now seemed unrecognizable. What had driven him to this? What could possibly justify a man plotting the death of his wife, the
Mother of his children.
For Heidi's father, John, the anger that seethed inside him was impossible to contain.
As a man who had worked hard all his life, who had built a stable home for his children, the thought of someone trying to destroy that stability, especially from within, was a violation that cut deep.
John was a man of few words, but the fury that he had tried to suppress for so long had now come to the surface.
He had tried to be understanding when Heidi and Stephen faced their marital struggles. Every marriage went through hard times, right? But this was a betrayal on a level that no one could have predicted. The hardest part for John was knowing that his daughter's trust had been shattered by the person she loved the most. He could only imagine how Heidi must have felt, knowing the man she had been married to, the man who had shared a bed with her, had secretly been making plans for her death.
John found himself wrestling with a host of emotions: anger, disbelief,
and a deep, gnawing sorrow.
The man he had once welcomed into his family, the man who had fathered his grandchildren, had become a monster in his eyes. But it wasn't just the families who felt the emotional devastation of Heidi's poisoning. There was a larger, unseen effect: the emotional toll it took on the community that had once embraced Stephen and Heidi.
Their neighbors, who had watched their children grow up together, were stunned. Everyone had seen Heidi as the picture of grace and warmth. Her home had been a gathering place for everyone.
But now, as the news of the poisoning and the affair leaked out, people felt a deep sense of betrayal.
They had trusted Stephen, and now they realized they had been living beside a man capable of such cruelty. One of Heidi's childhood friends, Monica, couldn't believe the man she'd once shared countless memories with could be capable of this. Monica remembered the days when Heidi and Stephen had first met, the spark between them, the way they seemed inseparable. Back then, Stephen had been the golden boy, the one everyone admired.
Now, Monica couldn't even look him in the eye without
seeing the contempt for what he had done. She didn't just feel for Heidi, she felt for her children, for the innocent souls who would never understand why their father had betrayed their mother in such a brutal way. As the investigation deepened and more secrets came to light, the emotional toll on those closest to
Heidi continued to grow. The truth was too much to bear.
It wasn't just about the cyanide, it was about the life that had been taken, the trust that had been broken, and the lasting scars that would never fade.
The more they uncovered, the more
it became clear that Heidi had not only been poisoned by a deadly substance, but by the very man who had promised to cherish her forever. And as they dug deeper, it became increasingly apparent that the emotional devastation from this betrayal would reach far beyond Heidi's family. It would echo through every life Stephen had touched. The community, once so tightly knit, now had to face the painful reality that someone they had trusted was capable of such a heinous act.
And the ripples of that betrayal would be felt for years to come. The investigation into Heidi's poisoning had been progressing slowly, but the real breakthrough came when the phone records between Stephen and the inmate surfaced. It was a chilling
revelation that shifted the case into a much darker direction.
The calls between Stephen and this man, a convicted killer named Paul Donovan, had been occurring regularly, and the content of their conversations was far from innocent. At first, investigators had believed the affair might have been the sole motive for the poisoning.
But as they listened to the calls, it became clear that this wasn't just about a man seeking to rid himself of a wife who had become an inconvenience. These weren't the frantic conversations of a man caught up in an emotional affair.
They
were cold, deliberate, and eerily methodical. Stephen had been in contact with Paul not for an emotional release, but to plan the murder of his wife. Paul Donovan, serving a lengthy sentence for a violent crime, had become a key figure in this twisted plot.
The nature of their discussions revealed a disturbing level of premeditation, as if Stephen was being coached on how to execute the perfect crime. It wasn't just about poisoning Heidi, it was about making sure she wouldn't survive, making sure
that her death would be covered up, and that no one would ever suspect foul play.
Every detail, from the timing of the poisoning to the way the cyanide was administered, was laid out with surgical precision. The turning point came when investigators connected the dots: the cause, the affair, the calculated plan. It wasn't just about love or betrayal, it was about control, manipulation, and a cold-blooded plot to silence a woman. The investigators had been chasing leads, but now they knew this was no longer just a case of poisoning.
It was a planned execution, orchestrated from behind bars. As the evidence against Stephen mounted, so did the tension. With each new discovery, the walls were closing in on him.
The phone calls with Paul Donovan were just the beginning. Investigators uncovered a trail of suspicious activity, unexplained financial transactions, a stash of cyanide that had gone missing from Stephen's office, and an airtight timeline that connected the poisoning to a specific moment in time. The
day Heidi collapsed. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that weighed on Stephen.
It was the emotional fallout, the strain of keeping up the facade while knowing the truth was beginning to slip out of his control. In the quiet moments, when the pressure was at its peak, Stephen's calm exterior cracked.
His behavior became erratic. He started changing his story, offering conflicting explanations for key details.
At one point, he even tried to divert attention,
suggesting a botched robbery or an accident.
But nothing, he said, could account for the incriminating evidence that had started to pile up. The detectives, who had once been hesitant to accuse him outright, now knew they were on the brink of something bigger. It was clear Stephen had been living a lie, and the truth was about to come crashing down around him.
As the investigation accelerated, so did the pressure.
Time was running out, and so was Stephen's chance to escape, just when it seemed like
the case was about to reach its conclusion. A final, shocking piece of evidence surfaced.
A hidden video, buried deep in Stephen's digital files, showed him in a secret meeting with Paul Donovan talking about a final plan to ensure Heidi's
death went undetected.
As the video played, it became clear this wasn't over yet. The deeper they dug, the more sinister the plot became.
Was there an even darker truth waiting to be revealed? The investigation was far from finished, and the biggest twist might still be ahead.
Stay tuned. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and drop comment below.